All right, I think we need to kick off, otherwise, we'll go late into the night. So our next final presenter, I guess, is the man, the myth, the legend, Eric from AWS, an inspiration to me personally.
Oh, thank you.
Every talk that Eric does, I love it. It's so fun, so interesting, and I learned so much. So tonight, you are doing understanding application integration with EventBridge Pipes.
That's right.
Sounds very interesting. Thank you, Eric.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Thank you. Tonight, we're going to be talking about EventBridge Pipes. So real quick before we get started, let me ask, who has heard me speak before? Okay. All right. Not enough of you that came out weird. Not enough, I'm out. No. I need to give the rules. That's basically it. Do you know the rules?
Well, please.
Okay, yeah. So there are rules when I talk, and it's because I've got the mic, and you're like, who are you to make rules? But I do anyway. So the first rule is this. Okay, you ready? This is any number I want it to be. Okay? At some point, I'm going to hold this up. I'm going to say 7. I'm going to say 15. It's whatever I'm saying, not what I'm holding up. And I say that because I use my hands a lot, when I'm speaking, and I do that. It never fails. I say, there are 8 of us for a table at a restaurant, and I find myself alone at the bar because they weren't listening, right? So the second thing is these are quotes, not apostrophes. And I know that because this looks better than this. Because it never fails when I do this. Someone says, is he doing a bunny? Do it back, And finally, these are thumbs. I do this a lot as well. So I do make a lot of one-finger jokes. I was born this way, not the first time this morning. If it was the first time this morning, I would not be here with you. Okay? I'd be somewhere coping with that. So I'm very comfortable. Like I said, I make a lot of jokes. If that makes you uncomfortable, I'm also comfortable with that. So I'm good either way here. So let's have some fun. So this is my first time in Melbourne. I have decided it is the best part of Australia that I've been to. So I already got points. I have eaten way more than one my size should eat, and that's been great. I have also walked more than one my size should walk, and that's Paul's fault. But that's not important. So. If you don't know me, a little bit about who I am, I'm a principal developer advocate at AWS. I've been doing serverless since they came out with it. I remember watching it and going, why would you do it any other way? I've been a solutions architect for 10 plus years. I've been a developer for almost 30 years. Yes, I am that old. And yes, I remember when they came out with tables in HTML. I was so excited. I'm that old. So. I am a father of 5. How many? Okay, yeah, it's like 1. That's easy. I'm a husband to a superstar, obviously, because I'm out gallivanting around the world and she has 5 kids. I am a drummer that used to say musician, but people go, really? He's a drummer? So turns out, here's the fun thing. Turns out I am a phenomenal drummer for one finger. Past that, I'm really average, and nobody's going to pay me to do it. So, and then I am a lover of pizza. Now, Jeremy Daly, I'm going to call Jeremy out here. I don't think he's here, so he won't hear this. Here he is. So, Jeremy Daly isn't one of us. So, he doesn't even know serverless. We're just going to pick on him because he ate pineapple pizza. I don't believe pineapple should be on pizza. But that's not what I'm here to talk about. That's just one of my things I talk about. So, today, let's get into what we're actually here to talk about. We're going to talk about a quick introduction to application integration. What do we mean when we talk about application integration? We're going to talk about Amazon EventBridge Pipes, which is a new service that we just came out with, or a new feature, EventBridge Pipes example, and then some final thoughts as they come to me. So we'll see what happens. So first of all, let's talk about a quick introduction to application integration. What do I mean when I say application integration? Well, in the beginning, there was code, right? And if you remember, as we built applications, we built everything into the code. We handled routing, we handled authorization, we had queuing, pub sub, event buses, business logic. We had all this stuff, but we handled it because we were developers. We handled it in our code, right? Because we're developers. We always do it better than other developers, right? No, I got that. I'm a developer. I'm writing the next great authentication system, right? So we always did it in our code. That was in the beginning. Every aspect of it was there. So then we came out and we brought out the service. And this is something AWS brought out with the different services that we built. And we said, you know what? We feel like a lot of the stuff you're doing in your code, you really don't need to. You don't need to rewrite storage. You don't need to rewrite the authentication. What you need to work on is your business logic. That sounded really accusing, didn't it? You really need to get better at your business logic, but you do. That's what you need to work on. You don't need to be distracted by all those things. So we came out with these services that abstract that away, and you can see some of those here. You know, routing and authorization through API gateway, pub sub and SNS, event buses, and so on. So we came out with that. Now, when you think about working with serverless, it's not so much about sitting down and writing lines and lines and lines of really bad code if you're me. I know it says developer advocate in my title, but that's because they couldn't fit hack developer on my card. I'm a hack developer, right? I'm better at chaining together services in what we call a serviceful manner, right? And so where application integration comes in is instead of me shipping all this stuff around in my code, I can take and use these services that abstract that away and tie it together with my application integration services, like an EventBridge, like an Amazon DynamoDB, and so on, or where it moves around. And we have several services that handle it in different ways: queuing, pub sub, buses, and so on. But now there's an even more nower. Okay, so this is an American term for somewhere between now and the future. I wasn't ready to say the future because it is now, so it's nower. Okay, and so what we've got is this idea of point-to-point routing. Instead of me having to move it and maybe ship it to the next step and things like that, what if what I really need to do is I need to go to A to B, and I don't want to do some of the hops, right? So I'm going to go A to B, and so we came out with this idea. I say we, I had nothing to do with the idea. Emily probably did. I had nothing to do with the idea. And that's Amazon EventBridge Pipes. Has anybody used Pipes so far? Okay, great. Okay, a couple of you looking. All right, great. Anybody heard of it? Okay, very cool. More in the room. That's very cool. So I'm going to talk to you about what does it do, why do we do it, how does it work for you? So you have this idea of sources and targets. This point-to-point routing, we're going to go from A to B. So these are our sources at the time: DynamoDB Stream, Kinesis Streams, Amazon MQ, MSK, and SQS. And you're probably seeing a theme, right? So this is where data is ingested. Lots of stuff is coming in, right? And we want to be able to just route that somewhere. So these are our sources. Our targets, on the other hand, you see a lot of different things: API destination, API gateway, SNS, Amazon, SQS. You see I can route things back and forth a little bit. So we can take and say, okay, I've got a bunch of data in one of my sources, and I need it in one of my targets. I'm going to point to point. I'm going to point those directly at each other. It kind of looks like this. So, all right, well, that's kind of cool, but what does that get me? Could I do that in EventBridge now? Probably so. Could I do that in SQS or SS? Probably so. But what we feel like is there's more than just saying, hey, we have all this data and we want to ship it over. We think that it would be easy to also say, but we want to filter it and we want to do some other things to it. So let's take a look. The first thing we've got is we do have the ability to filter events. And on this, it's much like you can do in EventBridge now, where you can say, okay, if I've got this ton of events coming in, and I want to ship them off to one of our targets, but I don't need all of it. I just need some of it, okay? And so I can actually go in, let me show you what a filter looks like. I can build a filter, and so this is an example of maybe a Kinesis filter, where we're saying it needs to be partition key 1. That one I can do without any problem. The truth is, I can get to 4 if I take my shoes off, but it gets weird for everybody. So I just want you to know that I'm here for you and being nice to you. So anyway, partition key of 1, and then we say the city has to be Seattle. So only that data will be routed in our point-to-point direction or routing. So the next thing we can do is we have this idea of it, data enrichment. Now this is where it gets really cool. And you might be looking at this and going, yeah, but I can do that already. You can, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit, and why this helps you a lot. Because you can write, because you're developers, and we write, all developers are the best at it, and you can write your own code to do all this. But are you using proper use of your time? And so what we've done here is we've said we will actually set up to do an enrichment. And you can do an AWS Lambda function. It's kind of hard to see, an API endpoint, Amazon API gateway. You might be looking at those and going, what's the difference? This is usually like a third party. If I want to call out to a third party, a location service or something like that and pull it in, or I can use Amazon API gateway to do one of the internal services or something like that, I can enrich data. And finally, I can use the step functions to enrich data. I can call these synchronously or asynchronously, and I can, or some of them, depending on some of the patterns, and we'll climb into that in a little bit. And what that allows me to do is as data's flowing through, either as single units, one event at a time, or in batches, I can enrich this data with something like a comprehend or something like that. Okay? So, but in order to do that, and one thing to call out is I can also filter at data. So if I need a little more logic than what my JSON path offers me, I can filter. All right, have a good day. Oh, okay. All right, thank you. It really goes downhill from here. So no, there we go. Okay, so I can filter by just simply returning an empty array. That means don't do this one. So I can actually apply a good amount of business logic to these events, saying the very, very complex logic as I'm filtering through. The other thing we do is we offer this idea of data transformation. Okay, we say, okay, as you're going into filtering, or enrichment, you're doing your filtering, as you're going into enrichment, we're going to allow you to adjust the data, to remap it, reformat it, using much like this, a structure like this, where we can say, okay, you had first name in one field, last name in another field, we want to combine those. However your enrichment service needs it to be, you can actually transform that to match that, which is really slick because we do this a lot of times. We find ourselves doing this where? Anybody want to guess? Software, right. And we do it at Lambda functions. We end up injecting these Lambda functions where we're trying to do a lot of work. Now, it may be a Lambda function that's doing the work here, but we take off that cognitive load of saying, I need you to do transforms as well, and then let's do the enrichment. By the time the Lambda function or API or step function or whatever gets it, it should be in the exact format that it needs to be in. And it's done with a very simple transformation pattern here. And that you can apply that going into the enrichment. You can also apply it coming out of the enrichment, coming into the target service. So what you've been able to do here is flip-flop this data around, enrich that data by looking at whatever service you need, adding, again, let's evaluate with comprehend, let's translate it with text, let's change it to audio, whatever you want to do, and then format it again for however you want to save it. And again, where we usually do that is at that, in a Lambda function that we've coded to do that. So this is what the full cycle looks like. You come in, data's sitting in one of these services. They come through, the events can be filtered. It's optional. You don't have to filter, right? Then you can do a transformation, again optional. You can do data enrichment, optional. And you can do a transformation at the end as you go into a target. Point to point, I've come from A to B, I've turned the data as I need it to be done, and there you go. And then you have a lot of services, the robustness of EventBridge built in there. All right, so let's take a look at some things to read more on, okay? So a couple things here. Batch processing, okay? When you're doing batches, EventBridge Pipes supports batch records from sources and will send batch records to targets that support batches, right? So if I'm using a Lambda function, or let's say I'm using SQS as a batch, we can do those batches, right? We can, or a Lambda function that can run batches. So you have that ability. If it supports batches at the source and at the target, you can use that. Concurrency. Every event or batch of events received by a pipe that travels to an enrichment or target is considered a pipe execution. And you can see regions are limited to 1,000 concurrent executions. So that's a lot. And again, and I'm sure everybody in this room, because I know who we are, we all know concurrency is not per second concurrency at the same time, right? So it's pretty quick and a lot of stuff going on. Finally, parsing. Pipes does some magic for you if it's base 64, and some of the services like Kinesis kick things out, and Pipes does some magic where it's going to convert that for you. Base 64, escaped, unescaped, things like that. So that'll help out. There's a lot more on this. I did a little URL if you want to grab it, s12d.com pipes, to grab some of that, some of that data and exactly how these are done. All right. So here's an example, and I'm not going to do code. I just want to talk through this and why we do this. So a common example that I've seen before is we have a ton of data coming in, and we want to do some work around that. We want to enrich the data. We want to change the data. It's coming into Kinesis, and then we're going to pipe it out to another Kinesis stream. Then we're going to do something else with it later. We don't care. Okay. So what we would usually do is in this example, I'm using comprehend. Okay. So what we would usually do is we would attach that Lambda function on the Kinesis stream. We would do some work, and then we would ship it out. And here's what we would deal with on that. Okay. So in my code, I would have to write filtering logic. Am I going to work on every event? No, I need to write that filter. The next thing I would have to write or do is I would have to format the payload for comprehend. Okay, I'm already tired, right? So now I'm having to do that. So by this time, the way I code, I'm not proud of this, but the way I code, I probably have 12 to 15 if-thens in my code by this point. Just these two things, right? So the third thing we're going to do is I have to work out the SDK call to call comprehend, right? So I've had to figure out the SDK and look up the SDK docs, and I'm always in the wrong one and go, so there you go. So then what I need to do is when the response comes back, because I'm kicking it into Kinesis, I need to format it correctly. Then I need to figure out the SDK call to Kinesis, or figure out how I'm going to call and put that data in Kinesis. And finally, because it's my code, I'm sure everything went well, but for y'all, I'm going to put some error handling and retry logic in the code. And so what we've got here is we've got this point of throttling or point of failure that any one of these kicks us out. And we've got a problem. We've lost data. And when, in the industries we work in, losing data, that's bad. Okay, these are thumbs down. All right? That's a bad thing. These are thumbs. This is the honest truth at home. I use these as thumbs because this will get you beat up. Okay, that's just the truth. So, anyway, let's look at this same scenario. What if I wanted to do this using pipes? So what's a good way to do that? So the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to connect, and you notice my Lambda, I've just stripped it right out of there. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to handle our filter logic and make sure the logic is, the payload is in the format that I need it to be. Second thing I'm going to do is, first thing is I'm filtering the one. So I've taken that first bit of logic. Eric's brain's on fried here. So I'm taking that first bit of logic and I'm filtering what should happen. The second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to format properly. Now at this point, I'm just using some JSON configuration. I don't have to code for this. I'm not evaluating the data. I'm simply writing the configuration to handle that. So I'm filtering and now I'm formatting. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to invoke, and I couldn't do this directly from Kinesis using to a step function, but because I'm using pipes, I can. I'm going to invoke a step function to do some work, right? Anybody use step functions in the room? Ah, yes. Everybody gets a hug later. Okay. Step function is a powerful tool that reduces lines of code. And you may be listening to me and go, man, you must hate code. I don't hate code. Code's critical, but code is a liability. That's the reality, right? It's the most untested part of our application usually. It's the most changing part of our application. And so anytime we can remove lines of code and we can replace it with configuration, we can replace it with battle-tested services like this, that helps us, right? So in this, what I'm going to do is with step functions, instead of me writing code for that SDK, for the transformation, I'm going to talk directly to this using the SDK in step functions. So at this point, I'm dragging and dropping, which makes me super happy, right? I'm dragging and dropping, I'm talking to comprehend, I'm getting the response, and I'm doing all I need to do. So what that's done is, first of all, that's enabled step functions like I talked about. It uses SDK integration to communicate with comprehend or over 200 other services or 10,000 API calls. It's just ridiculous how much you can do from that. And now I don't have to write all my error and retry logic because step functions is handling that for me, right? And I can do that at that point. Or I'm backing up to EventBridge to do that. Finally, once I kick that out, well, then maybe I need to reformat it. I might do my formatted step functions, but I certainly don't have to. It's just a past state where I can restart it. But I can also do it here. So I'm going to format it as I go in to Kinesis. And I drop it into Kinesis, and I've done. So what I've done here now is I haven't removed, or I have no code left. I've removed every line of code, and I've replaced it for configuration, and I've got a direct connection. Any questions on that so far before I jump on?
Are you going to deal with any errors that happen during formatting?
Right, so depending on where it hits, okay, I have some retry power built into EventBridge where I can do retry, drop out to DLQ. Step functions, same thing. This kind of stuff is built in where if I get back 400, if I get back an error, it falls apart, I can actually drop that into a DLQ later. I can retry for a while with step back. There's a better word, there's a more high-tech word for that, but with step back, with trying less amount of times in a row. And if it doesn't work, then I'm going to drop it in a DLQ. And the DLQ, I keep saying that, but the DLQ is a dead letter queue. And it's just a queue that I can go back and manually look at and go, there you go. Does that help? That didn't help. What you got?
Well, you're so desperate to avoid code. I don't know what you're trying to do. Like, are you trying to replace it with configuration?
So I'm not,
The problems
yeah.
remains the same. Like,
You bet.
if things go wrong, you have to deal with it.
Absolutely right. Yeah. And I agree with you. I'm not desperate to remove code. I'm desperate to remove repeated code. Code that's already been put in place to handle that stuff. I don't want to rewrite the same thing over and over and over. If this didn't exist, if this didn't handle my error and retry already, battle tested, repeatedly tested, then I would write the code in place for that. Or this would go back to a Lambda function where I could do it. I have no problem dealing with that. I do have a problem with repeating that process that's already been done before. Does that make sense? And it certainly comes to preference. There are some people who go, you know what? I can do it better. And there's a good chance you can. Eric Johnson cannot. So I know a better chance for me is to catch these things where the services handle those. Because I know that people way smarter than me have built in these retry values, have built in these DLQ processing, things like that. But if you want to handle the errors, you go, look, I want to handle it. You can absolutely kick that, stay with the Lambda function, keep it in code, and say, I'm going to deal with that. So you have preference. All right, what else? All right. I think we're almost at time, so I'm just going to give a few final thoughts. I'm going to tell you what I think makes sense in this, and we'll go back to do that. I want to go back to the source and target screen. So this is a really cool service to do this point-to-point direction. I'm going to go from here to here. It's kind of funny, though. I've seen some examples that say, you know what? I'm going to build an example that shows DynamoDB streaming, and I'm going to have it as my target be a Lambda function. Okay? I'm not going to do any filtering. Or I'm not going to do any enrichment. Maybe I'll do a little enrichment, but that's all I'm going to do. For EventBridge Pipes, you're going to pay 40 cents for every million invocations, or for every million events going through. Okay? So you're going to pay 40 cents for every million that you do that, and you're going to pay for an invocation of that Lambda function. If I do a direct stream invocation of a Lambda function, I've just dropped myself 40 cents per million. Okay? So the point I'm making is there are some services already built in. You want to think about how you're doing. Am I taking advantage of the filtering? Am I taking advantage of the enrichment? And am I taking advantage of the transformations? Then it makes a lot of sense. But sometimes we get excited. I could just invoke. The other side of that, though, is, as I showed earlier, is a stream cannot invoke a step functions. At least not last time I checked. It could be different now. But with the point-to-point, I absolutely can. So now I had that ability to drive that. So as you think about this, and when you compare these, here's where it gets really advantageous is, a lot of times, and this is a really good pattern, when we build event-driven architectures, one of the patterns is when I'm done, I've got some kind of event, I'm going to kick it into EventBridge. I always kick an event into EventBridge, and that's great because then we say anything downstream can work off that. Okay, yeah, I have to do something, I have to react to that. But if that's not the case, and we go, I know it needs to go from A and it has to go from B, then instead of kicking it into EventBridge and using this, what I've done is I've dropped 60 cents per million. We charge $1 per million on EventBridge, and this is 40 cents per million. So as you're evaluating how you're going to approach that, what am I doing? Like anything else, I know this is very remedial, like right tool, right job. And I'm a big fan of that. But as you're evaluating that, I encourage you to look at what am I doing? Am I taking advantage of what it's offering? And I encourage you to really look at that and say, yeah, I'm going to use the enrichment. I'm going to use that. If I'm, like back to my example, if I'm just kicking out to a Lambda function from a stream, and then the Lambda function is doing something else, a lot of that can be done in code, and it may not be worth the filtering for me. But if I know that I have another target that's moving on where I'm dropping all that in, it needs to be filtered and streamed or filtered and enriched before that, then it makes a lot of sense. So with that, kind of my final thoughts, I want to kind of open it up. I've been shut down again here. I think this is Peter doing it because of the Melbourne statement. But any other questions? Yeah.
When building step functions, one of the hardest parts is mapping data and triaging that and getting that right.
Yeah.
Debugging that.
Yeah.
So debugging serverless is hard.
Yeah.
And with step functions, it can be quite painful. Is this making it any easier, or do you still have, how do you map, if you're mapping, doing those transforms, are you making it any easier for us to actually debug that?
So, no. I would love to say yes. We're making it easier to get it to there, but once you're inside of that, here I'm in the step functions box. I do have some tips on debugging. I work with step functions all the time, and we've done some great things around it. ASL is hard. I can't even spell it. I mean, ASL is hard, right? And so, and I have some tips on that, but this is not going to help you in debugging and that. This is going to help you in routing and simplify that routing sometimes, but no, it wouldn't fix that, what you're talking about. So I appreciate that. Yeah?
I'm just trying to get the gist of what
Please.
you're trying to tell us.
Yeah.
So as opposed to using code in a Lambda function, whatever, to process the data as it goes across, are you promoting the idea that no, drag and drop is your option to manipulate the data as a better option? Am I getting this? Am I getting this wrong?
So, I've emphasized the wrong thing if that's what we walk away from, and I appreciate the question. Drag and drop is a way to, it's not there, but if there were a step functions machine right there, state machine, drag and drop is a way to build that. We have this drag and drop, and it's specifically for step functions. So I want to make that clear. So I can drag and drop and configure a lot of routing. What I believe is, again, let me go back to right tool, right job. I believe that Lambda functions in code are really critical for the things that we can't do with simple, for transforming data, for taking our business logic and applying it to that data and getting unique answers out of it that nobody else is doing. I believe that sometimes our code ends up spending so much time routing data. And that's where our app integration comes in and say, you know what, stop worrying about the routing data. You worry about the code, the business logic, and that's where code, I'm an absolute believer in code. But I think that sometimes it's 300 lines of routing, here's our business logic, and 300 lines of routing more. So take all that, move it into an application integration system like this, and let that logic really concentrate on that. Does that make more sense?
So how are you going to do the transformation of the payloads?
So the transformation... Yeah. Are we okay to?
Look, we're running out of time
Okay.
quickly, so
Yeah.
maybe if possible we take this
I'll be
question.
glad to take it offline with you, yeah.
I think we did have one question
Yeah.
over there. Yes.
I have one question is because I can see S3 is not as a target or the source. And it seems like currently the source is quite limited. And is there any plan to add new source in the future like S3 buckets?
So we're always evaluating new targets and sources. to see what's happened. This is a service that came out, I think at reInvent is when we announced it. So we're always evaluating new sources based on, when I started with Amazon, I was like, is that really true? It really is. 95% of the things we build, or higher, that percentage is probably higher, is based on what customers tell us. So if customers are saying, hey, we need this to go to S3, that's something we're going to evaluate. So, yeah.
Look, I'm very sorry to put an end to this party. Eric, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you.
The good news is Eric is tomorrow going to be spending all day at Serverless Days.
Serverless Days.
So if you're attending tomorrow, please come and ask all your questions. He'll be there available for 12 hours, maybe 15.
Longer every time. I'm going to stay with Paul. He's nicer. So, thank you very much.